When King Asheka I climbed Mount Jeyau, the highest peak in the world, it was twilight. After speaking to his god Unima'u and descending the mountains, it was dawn. This story, like the separation between the Twilight Era and Dawn Era, is fallacious and misleading. There is truly no differentiation between these eras except for an ancient myth and a slew of misconceptions, such as a mistaken belief that Aakow was the first nation-state or that they were the first to invent writing and agriculture. If anything, the people of Aakow were late to these discoveries, and their beloved King Asheka I was behind his time. Aakow was by no means the first nation upon Uthapaba. To Akaw's south was Oogair, an expansive civilization of high technology and culture who existed for centuries prior to the unification of Aakow. To Akaw's north were the nations of Jitalmank and Aakow, who similarly existed for centuries. Even beyond these centralized countries were the Copper Kingdoms with their cities of Oogair and Gyupi, and the far eastern Twin Peninsulas, despite their scattered society, were home to cities, cultures, advanced technology, trade, diplomacy, and more. Most of these pre-Aakow societies also have their own myths of lost, ancient civilizations that preceded even them. Jitalmank myths mention the Ahu'awa Goiku Or, a civilization of past fathers who once ruled northwestern Uthapaba. Aakonk's lands are covered with the ruins of the Embosink civilization, whose self-destruction led to the rise of Aakonk. The Twin Peninsulas are also home to ruins throughout the region, most notably below the Ainirirch and the sunken city of Mihamau. The notion that Aakow was the first to invent writing and agriculture is also absurd. Assuming Akaw's achievements at this time are rightfully attributed to King Asheka I, the best that he did was invent a phonetic writing system based on the languages of Aakow and later Horjan, and invent irrigation with the help of the rivers. Though important steps in developing Aakow society, these technological feats are hardly cause for the change of an era. All of the aforementioned civilizations, Aakonk, Jitalmank, Oogair, the Copper Kingdoms, and the Twin Peninsulas, all had writing systems of their own languages for so long that their invention isn't even recorded in known history. In terms of agriculture, some of the different agricultural techniques of Twilight Era civilizations are better than what Aakow has now during contemporary times, over a millennium after the start of the Dawn Era. The Twin Peninsulas had strains of common crops that were selectively bred for generations to allow them to grow in high saline environments, to bypass land salted during ancient conflicts, and to allow for ocean-based agriculture in an attempt to expand usable terrain. Oogair society had irrigation techniques that, though now lost, were profound at their height, and are claimed to have been so good that they turned their desert lands into a lush, green paradise. Even tribal people, such as those in the northwestern regions of Uthapaba, made use of the Achur cactus, known also as the Miracle of the Desert, as a crude but important form of agriculture. Once again, Aakow was far behind in their discoveries. The most honest reason behind the turn of eras is the spread of Aakow culture all throughout Uthapaba during the Dawn Era. From Aakow, their culture spread into Horjan, then Ayakidgu, then the Copper Kingdoms, into Anonk and Amishgog, then into Oogair and the Pramamreki, then into the Twin Peninsulas to the Pramamreki cartographers of Ithkink, into the Uyaj Uwina through Kahu, and into Jitalmank and Aakonk through the Ipo Olgwe. All of these colonization attempts and exilements led to the normalization of varying degrees of Aakow culture, the most common of which being their way of telling time and the distinction in eras, leading to the Twilight Era and Dawn Era getting adopted as legitimate and distinct time periods. While the distinction between eras is arbitrary, it is true that history started becoming well documented as a result of King Asheka I's insistence on the literacy of the common people so that they could read his religious propaganda, and the encouragement of documenting historical events, transaction, laws, mythology, and diplomatic agreements. Like the divide in eras, the prevalent use of writing and literacy spread around Uthapaba, making it much easier to track events starting in the Dawn Era. This effect is exaggerated by more ancient societies being destroyed and replaced by Aakow-adjacent cultures, such as Oogair, Aakonk, and Jitalmank, all being destroyed by the various Thalaspora of Aakow, who are ruthless in their destruction of historical, cultural, and religious documents, destroying large swaths of what little Twilight Era history was written down. Regardless of the arbitrary divide between eras, and despite how muddled Twilight Era history has become, It is possible to discern, at least in part, some of the historical events and cultures of the Twilight era based on mythology, conjecture, archaeology, old surviving documents, and the biased writings of more modern culture. The first of many of these Twilight era civilizations was the elusive Jitaoming. Far to the west, as far as one can go, was once Jitaoming. Jitaoming's history is elusive, contradictory, speculative, and shrouded in mystery as a result of their enigmatic culture, scarce records, contradictory histories from themselves and neighboring peoples, and their destruction late to the Dawn era. Nonetheless, what is known about Jitaoming is fascinating. The original founders of Jitaoming are believed to have had a strong link to Oogair, who was known to have existed shortly before Jitaoming. They had the same religion, the Gardener's Cult, the same purpose, to reseed life into and eradicate the Western Desert, and similar physical attributes like their distinct green eyes. It's theorized that Jitaoming was either a colony of Oogair, or that they both originated from the same source, that being an eastern group from around God's Feet or the Toyat River. Regardless of the initial similarities, the cultures of these two quickly and drastically shifted. Essentially everything pertaining to Jitaoming had to do with their religion, the Gardener's Cult, and their obsessive infatuation with one specific aspect of it, the prophecy of Oigunal. According to Jitaoming, Oigunal is a doomsday figure who will come to reap and destroy the civilizations of the world. Jitaoming, deeply afraid over this prospect, formed and constantly reformed their society and culture with the purpose of achieving immortality through thwarting Oigunal. The ways Jitaoming did this was through militarizing, isolating, and defending their nation, deliberately confusing Oigunal through misinformation, slander, and shrouding their own history, and through the visions and decrees of their priestly caste. Within Jitaoming history, the original settlers of Jitaoming went to the western corner of Uthapaba to reclaim and recreate an ancient people known as the Ahu'au Agoiku, whose ruins litter the west, whose exact nature isn't known, and who have absolutely no relation or similarities to Jitaoming other than geography. The leader of the first settlers who formed Jitaoming was an ambitious, strict, and just adventurer named Urchasunku, who shortly after landfall made his way to the westernmost land on Uthapaba, where he fell into a deep and sudden sleep on the coast. Urchasunku could not be woken, yet in his deep slumber he spoke of all manner of things: prophecies, riddles, poems, commands, and one-sided conversations. Since the people of Jitaoming could not wake Urchasunku, they instead decided to keep him alive to preserve both his life and his sleeping words, which were viewed as divine. They did everything in their power to keep him alive in sleep, force-fed him, gave blood transfusions, and more, their methods of preserving his life becoming more complicated over time, until by the end of Jitaoming society, Urchasunku was surrounded in pumps and mechanisms and filled with tubes and strange instruments. From the start of Jitaoming civilization until the end, it is said that Urchasunku remained alive as the immortal, dreaming king. Since the leader of Jitaoming was unable to rule with the exception of his occasional garbled commands, a more practical rulership arose instead, an octumvirate of priestesses called spinners. These priestesses believed that they could ascertain the future based on the direction and movement of their knotted hair, and that while in sudden and unpredictable trances, they could weave their hair into tapestries of future events. These tapestries were sewn together to create the Tapestry of All Tomorrows, a fabric timeline of all the future events that could have been. The Tapestry of All Tomorrows was large enough that it flowed all throughout the city's temple, making it completely filled and nearly unusable, save for the few chambers meant for the octumvirate, and it extended even further outside the temple, billowing from out of the windows and doors and blanketing the city. Most of the trances of the octumvirate spinners were visions of when and how Oigunal would destroy Jitaoming, and the decrees of the spinners were always made with the purpose of delaying their end, slowly pushing back the end of Jitaoming one vision and one decree at a time. Intermixed with the trances of the spinners was a culture of divine inspiration. It was believed by Jitaoming that any great idea, be that a technological or cultural invention, a new law, or any other discovery or new concept, was divinely inspired and gifted by their gods to further Jitaoming society and further push back the end of their civilization. The changes done to Jitaumic civilization as a result of the spinners were immense. Entire cultural practices and ways of life were changed, colors and words were forbidden or forced, certain architectural styles and buildings were created and destroyed, literature, songs, and plays were forbidden, histories were rewritten, names were changed, everything changed. Jitaumic was constantly warped and reinvented in an attempt at changing every aspect of society, even retroactively, over and over again to delay the end of Jitaumic, making their civilization intangible to spare it from Oikunal by any means. To enforce these changes, a sect of thought guards called the Alhijar would follow every word of the spinners, forcing everyone within Jitaumic and neighboring tribes to act and think a certain way, and it wasn't uncommon for people to be executed out of suspicion of them believing the wrong thing, truth, or fabricated. Entire towns and native groups were entirely eradicated in thought wars, such as the Achotha, a tribal group who once inhabited the land that became Jitaumic. Other than the religious and cultural obfuscation, Jitaumic became an extremely withdrawn and militant country, refusing to interact with most outside of their country. The entirety of Jitaumic was like a fortress, with battlements, walls, bunkers, and forts densely scattering their lands, and soldiers constantly patrolled the streets, ports, and borders. Their hope was that, shall the spinners fail in their attempts at stalling Oikunal, the people of Jitaumic would be ready for, and could potentially outlast or even defeat Oikunal when that day finally comes. Though Jitaumic was largely defensive, they did meddle with local groups on occasion, mostly for the sake of trade. Jitaumic soldiers unofficially explored or fortified key locations outside of their official borders, such as the ruins of Agane, and the Alhijar frequently infiltrated neighboring groups with disguises or proxies to mold them into whatever shapes they wished. Despite Jitaumic society perpetually changing itself, there were some constants. One example is the average person's obsession with living for as long as they could, trying to make themselves immortal just as they were trying to make the country immortal. The people of Jitaumic were health-focused, and they would live active, healthy lifestyles and drink and eat life-giving medicines and concoctions in hopes of prolonging their lives. This attempt worked, with people in Jitaumic often reaching 100 or more years of age. The richest and most influential of Jitaumic, such as the spinners, would drink the blood of other people, the younger the better, to maintain a longer life. There was even an enforced blood tithe on the local tribal groups, and sacrificing newborn children to the spinners was a common ritual. The attempt to be immortal remained after death, where it was a common practice for young adults to take the place of newly deceased individuals, assuming their jobs, families, names, hobbies, mannerisms, and style, all for the sake of social stability. But the truth is that the deceased wanted to remain alive after death. Within Jitaumic, hair was also an important cultural aspect. Nobody was allowed to cut their hair on any part of their body, ever. The only time when somebody's hair was cut was in death or as a common and shameful punishment. The hair would then be taken and tied to the ends of the hair of the spinners until they became completely covered and unrecognizable. This ritual became so cumbersome to the spinners that servants were needed to support them in everyday life, yet even these servants were tied to the priestesses by their hairs. The outnumber of spinners were so close together and covered in hairs that they became tangled together into one large mess of hair and tapestry. It was also very common for people to use hairstyles reminiscent of whips, which were used during self-flagellation rituals in which individuals would beat themselves with their own hair as a form of self-reproachment and repentance. The last important aspect of Jitaumic is a peculiar and unexplainable myth known as the Green Shift or the Twilight Disparity. According to Jitaumic, at one point in history, Jitaumic was enveloped by a strange aura of mist that turned everything green. This event lasted for a short while before coming to an end without any repercussion. Slowly, however, Jitaumic began to realize that the entire world outside of Jitaumic simply changed. Tribal groups and petty kingdoms disappeared, geography subtly changed, and individuals disappeared. Tribal groups outside of Jitaumic, such as the Cult of the Instrument, corroborate the story, reporting similar events in which a green wave washed over the region and Jitaumic suddenly appeared. This odd twilight disparity serves in many ways as a unilateral second creation story for Jitaumic, and its exact historic validity or cause is unexplained. To the east of Chitaumank along the northern shore, where the Embose River flows from the Oogair Mountains to the endless oceans, was Aakow, the second Twilight Era civilization. The city of Aakow stands tall and wide as a relic of forgotten pasts. Aakow is one of the oldest cities on Oothal, and it was originally built as a holy site dedicated to their goddess Auk, the goddess of beauty, compassion, and women. The first structure, the Temple of Auk, was, according to local oral legend, built after Auk spared the Aakow people from extinction at the hands of her brother god, Athergalth, for it was Auk who turned the Athergalth's thorns into flowers and poisons to perfume to spread kindness and beauty over Achotha instead of death and destruction. This ancient tale is why the people of Aakow loved and praised their patron goddess, and why they built the great city in her name. The culture of Aakow was highly matriarchal. They believed that women ought to rule the people, treating their subjects with love and care like their children, while the men provide. Women made up the overwhelming majority of government positions, whereas men made up most of the labor and military force. Although this stance wasn't the most outlandish to the northern tribes, the people of Aakow were the most staunch proponents of this ideal. The focus on women was so complete in Aakow that it was common for men to willingly volunteer to become eunuchs to appear more feminine, so much so that the population of Aakow suffered greatly throughout its history. To compensate for the population issues, a yearly festival of coition was orchestrated in the city, in which men from allied tribal groups would travel to Aakow to have children, with the caveat that the men were not allowed to stay or even know their potential offspring. As opposed to the harsh and barren western desert, the lands surrounding Aakow were pleasant and fertile. The river provided adequate fish and clean water, the grasslands allowed for plentiful farms and pastures, and the forest provided more than enough lumber and wild game. The people of Aakow were quite naturalistic, preferring the outdoors and natural areas as opposed to anything tight and enclosed. They had practically no mines whatsoever, very few tall buildings, and everything was spread out. The city of Aakow itself, even if in a more primitive state, was perhaps one of the largest cities in terms of width on all of Oothal. Practically every house had a garden, chicken coop, apiary, or other such structure, and the distance between buildings was relatively large. As a result, the people of Aakow are believed to be the first to figure out how to mount and ride cattle for transport, and specific breeds have been bred for generations to make them quicker and or to bear more weight. These breeds of cattle were the most widely used means of transportation, both within the city of Aakow and across its wider sphere of influence. Although Aakow's sphere of influence was large, Aakow itself was only a city-state, whose lands were small compared to the lands they could directly control if they so chose. They had just enough to house the city and a little more. Thanks to their revolutionary form of transportation, notoriously great diplomats, having the only agrarian culture and city in the north, and the only centralized government, Aakow maintained an impressive amount of tribal vassals that enabled Aakow to become a powerful region and expand their overall area of influence drastically. Although these tribal vassals contributed in a martial capacity, they were first and foremost an economic asset. The eastern tribes provided lumber and game, the southern tribes provided agriculture, fish, lumber, and game specific to the Oogair, and the western tribes provided animal products and metals from the Oogair Mountains. The most important of these tribes was the Hajulur-Gink to the west. The Hajulur-Gink tribe's patron god, Hajulur-Gi, is a deity of hunting, competition, sports, and animals. This tribe was the military backbone of Aakow, and whereas Aakow focused on plants and agriculture, the Hajulur-Gink people focused on animals, and they did so in a far more militaristic manner. They bred and armored dogs to fight, cattle to ride or as portable walls, chickens for eggs and goats for milk for provisions on campaigns, covered pigs in pitch and tar, set them ablaze and made them charge into enemies, nurtured hives of bees in jars to throw at enemies, used pigeons as couriers back home, and they domesticated eagles, bears, and lions to a limited capacity. This was done so that instead of wasting human lives, animals would instead take the majority of casualties, and it's claimed that the army of Hujulurgink had far more animals than humans. This unique type of warfare and martial culture is what allowed the Hujulurgink tribes to be so effective and pivotal to Aakow society. Though the military of the tribes of the Hujulurgink helped Aakow significantly, they still faced problems to the west in the Oogair Mountains. Within the mountains was a confederation of tribes known as the Oogair. The Oogair were decentralized, poor, warlike, and sedentary people who subsisted on mining in the mountains, banditry, and trading with other tribes. The Oogair were a people of different faith and culture than Aakow, and the two groups rarely got along. Conflicts between the Aakow and Oogair were perpetual along the northern tip of the Oogair Mountains throughout the Twilight Era and into the Dawn. Aakow wanted access to metals from the mountains, while the Oogair wanted agricultural products from the Embose River. Thanks to the Hujulurgink, the Oogair were never enough of a problem to trample through Aakow, but they were enough of an issue to prevent any permanent and long-lasting control over the mountains or reliable sources of metal. Other than the conflicts with the Oogair, Aakow faced no major outside threats, and their borders were limited more by administrative capacity and distance than by warfare. Everything within Aakow society was to further one purpose, the Archive of Kijki-Uf. The Archive of Kijki-Uf was a grand, imposing stone structure, larger than anything else ever built in the entire north. It was built outside of the city of Aakow on the outskirts, so that it could be expanded upon forever, and within its halls were innumerable texts and artifacts from all across the four corners. Though an archive in name, it served as more of a vault or even a dungeon, for much of the writings and artifacts within were kept there permanently, never to be seen again but by rare curators. All of the metal, lumber, animals, and food not used at home was used abroad to trade for artifacts. Aakow traders and archaeologists went as far as the Agane, Jitalmank, the Uyajuina, the Athergouth, and even the Twin Peninsulas of the east. Aakow uncovered and reclaimed ancient ruins all across the north, purchased artifacts from every culture they knew, and they would pay exorbitant sums of wealth to wise men just to hear their oral traditions, histories, stories, and beliefs. All of these artifacts and recounts were taken to the Archive of Kijki-Uf, where historians, scribes, and archivists cataloged and studied before shutting them behind closed doors. The Archive of Kijki-Uf was one of the most important locations in the Twilight Era, and arguably the earlier portion of the Dawn Era, and the secret histories hidden within were invaluable. Even though Aakow was the largest and most recent Twilight Era civilization in the area, two smaller but important groups called the region home, the people of Embosink and Orhink. The Embose River was named after Embose, a god of dreams, thoughts, and fungus. Before Aakow rose to prominence, followers of Embose had their own civilization, which was more sophisticated than Aakow ever was, and their nation was claimed to be the oldest upon Achotha. This ancient society was known for its heavy use of psychedelic drugs and their proclivity for sleeping, though their goal was not to sleep, but to wake up, for they believed that the world of Achotha was fake, and that the real world was glimpsed in dreams and death. The Embosink people would often practice lucid dreaming and could spiritually walk around Uthalpaba in their sleep, accurately describing events that happened as they were asleep, or places they never went to or could go to while awake. Embosink people would often write down, retell, and study their collective dreams, and the most well-versed of these scholars were known as dream seers. The art and architecture of these people was also eclectic, strange, and distinct from any other culture on Uthalpaba, and Embosink prided themselves in their colorful and unique culture. The Embosink were so enthralled with their own art that they became a civilization of art and decadence. The art of Embosink is often seen as so strange that their art styles and architecture are used by other cultures as psychological torture against prisoners, and many off-limits locations, like forts and some municipal buildings, are built with this style in mind to keep people away simply by how inhuman and unnatural they appear. This odd and colorful, though lesser-known culture, came to an end when the Embosink ritualistically ended their lives through imbibing psychedelic poisons to become free of their Achothan prison. The entirety of Embosing was destroyed by their own hand, but remnants of Embosing remained as a tribal group under the benevolent vassalage of Aakow, who arose in their destruction, and the infamous Yellow Book of Embose still circulates throughout the Four Corners. The second lesser civilization was Orhink. Orhi, their patron goddess, is a goddess of cacophony, chaos, music, and fear, whose son is the god Iriuawapu, a serpentine god that swims around Uthapaba in circles forever. The people of Orhink lived scattered around the northernmost corner of the world, all along the coast. Orhink's most important location was the city of East Orhink. A city in name only, the collection of driftwood and hide shacks that made up East Orhink was built around a large, deep cove on the northern coast. Within local legend, that cove was once a proper and flourishing city built out of kelp, glass, coral, and chitin, but it was pulled into the ocean by Iriuawapu, where it still remains, fully inhabited beneath the waves. The people of Orhink had strong nautical cultural motifs, and just like their sunken city, they had clothes and tools made out of or in the style of crustaceans, coral, shells, and other water-based materials. Orhink also had a sophisticated navy, with a large fleet that sailed along the northern coast. The boats were so large in number that more Orhink people lived on boats than land. Orhink also had an affinity for traveling over land too, for many of them would make an annual pilgrimage to the Uyajuina, where an enclave of Orhink took shelter at an ancient artifact of Orhi's called the Dread Drum, which was built into the plateaus of the region. While on this pilgrimage, Orhink travelers would never walk in a straight line. Instead, they made their journey moving side to side in a zigzagging manner until they made it to the Dread Drum to perform all manner of musical rituals to worship their cardinal deity. Unfortunately, both Embosing and Orhink were destroyed in ancient history, and come the Dawn Era and the rise of the Ipo Olgwe, Aakow, for all its power and influence, was annihilated by the Ipo Olgwe. The archive of Kijgiyuf specifically faced the greatest destruction, for the people of the Ipo Olgwe viewed the artifacts and text within as profane, evil, and even impossible. Now, Aakow is only a shadow of what they used to be, and their ancient twilight power, influence, and invaluable knowledge is gone. South of where old Aakow once stood, deep within the Uyajapukuel, was Goithop and the Athergauth, the next Twilight Era civilizations. Following southeast along the Oidigau Mountains from Aakow, one would soon reach the Uyajapukuel, the forest of redwood monoliths. The Uyajapukuel is a dense and dangerous forest with thick underbrush, dangerous creatures, and towering trees that touch the clouds and are as thick as a small house. The outskirts of the biome are generally sparse, but the foliage gets thicker and darker the further into the Uyajapukuel that you explore, until it's practically pitch black from the density of the redwood trees and their grand canopies. It's a biome that even today is left largely unexplored and uninhabited as a result of its dangerous nature and distance from most other large civilizations. Yet even in the Twilight Era, two lesser though important peoples called it home, the Athergauth and the priory city of Goithop. Within the center of the Uyajapukuel was a great tree called the Athergauth. The tree was not red wood like the rest around it, nor was it like any other tree on Uthapaba. It was a much deeper red than the surrounding trees, almost like blood. It spilled thick and faintly glowing orange-green nutritious sap down its nearly unbreakable bark. Its branches were immense in length and girth. The roots of the trees arched from out of the base into the air, then back into the soil. From out of the branches dangled precious and plentiful yellow fruits, similarly glowing, and around the base of the tree was a large pool of clean water, sweet from the sap, giving life to the Athergauth and the surrounding people. The Athergauth is said to even rival the height of Mount Chea'u, and was the true center of the world, a notion argued heavily by the cult of Unima'u and the Templars of the Heart as a heresy. According to local faiths, the Athergauth is a god tree who in ancient mythology brought plant life into Achotha through a plague of green that overgrew every corner of the world, nearly choking out all civilizations with thorns, poisons, and decay. That is why the Athergauth is unique among all other plants on Achotha, for it's the first and most divine of them all. Around the Athergalth was a grand city that shared its name. On the redwood trees around the rim of the Athergalth, circular platforms of wood with the center of the tree as the center of the platform were anchored into the trees with spikes and oars suspended with chains. These platforms were high enough off the ground to make the people safe from the dangerous wildlife below, and were large enough to allow for buildings where homes and industries functioned like any other. There were often 1 to 3 of these platforms per tree, and between each tree were sturdy bridges of ropes and planks suspended above darkness. These bridges and platforms were always busy and full of life as the people bustled to home, work, taverns, or places of entertainment or study. The underbrush was still pitch black, and yet they shunned flames of any kind in nearly every circumstance out of fear of the destruction that it could bring to such a place. Instead of fire, to produce light, some of the wooden platforms instead had thinly meshed fabric to allow for light and wind but not for escape, and these large tent platforms were dedicated to the breeding of lightning bugs who flew around the Athergalth in thick swarms, granting inconsistent light. The lightning bugs often congregated around the water at the base of the Athergalth, making it fiercely glow at all times of day. Other than the light from lightning bugs, the faintly glowing sap from the Athergalth, which flowed seemingly without end, often lined the edges of platforms, buildings, and walkways to signal where it was safe to walk. Though these two means of light were inconsistent and imperfect, it sufficed. The people of the Athergalth surprisingly had plenty of resources. The water from the base of the great tree, creeks, streams, aquifers, and common rains, allowed for more than enough water. Platforms created high up in the trees, high enough to allow for proper sunlight, were home to farms for plants and even livestock, the most common being pigs who would eat practically anything, including the large amount of dead fireflies littered all over the Athergalth, especially in the water below. The sap of the Athergalth was sweet and nutritious. The forest around was filled with plentiful although dangerous game, and the fruits from the Athergalth all allowed for surplus. Despite the surplus, nobody was close enough to reliably trade with save for the Templars of the Heart, who were sworn enemies. However, there have been recorded times in which they were willing to put their grudges aside for but a moment during rare, once-in-a-lifetime occasions. They made clothes of twine, leaf, and bark made from the plentiful nearby resources and workshops throughout the city, and they dressed quite well to shield themselves from insects and the elements. The way into this enclave of high civilization was not easy for all the reasons aforementioned, and the only people who knew the way were those from the Athergalth, and even then, only the warriors. The people used a collection of bridges, branches, and ropes to swing from between small platforms up near the canopies until they were close enough to touch down on far less risky land. Several of these paths led out from the Athergalth in a radius, so that they weren't reliant on any one path due to their eternal war with the Templars, and these paths were mapped, documented, and kept secret in the barracks of the soldiers of the Athergalth. The only other group who could come even close to the Athergalth were the Templars of the Heart from the priory city of Goithop. Still within the great forest of the Oogair, away south of the mighty Athergalth, the priory of Goithop rested as a beacon of light in the darkness offered by the thick canopies. Goithop was, and still is, situated in a man-made clearing within the forest, thanks to the effort of many felled trees, fires, and leaves plucked from the canopies with divine fervor. The wood taken from the great trees of the forest was then processed in a long and drawn-out process and sold abroad. Goithop, despite being a small civilization in an enclave far out from the rest of the east, was a, or perhaps the, leading manufacturer of lumber and wooden furniture in all of Uthapaba, even during the Twilight era, thanks to the demand of the estates of the east. The carpenters and woodworkers of Goithop were, and still today, are some of the greatest on Uthapaba, and thanks to the unique tint of the redwood trees they work, their works are coveted far and wide. Many of the Goithop woodworkers even specialized in creating wooden armor, which was treated to protect moderately against incoming attacks. Even if it wasn't perfect armor, it was still adequate when fighting against the more primitive people of the Athergalth and the Oogair more broadly. The clearing of the forest wasn't just for economic purposes, but rather it was a deliberate action not just of lumberjacks, for the people in Goithop were not mere settlers, but rather they were, and once again still are, an ancient sect of warriors known as the Templars of the Heart. These chain-clad warriors were the sworn protectors of the Four Corners, and they had chapters all throughout the east, from the estates of the Twin Peninsulas to the Copper Kingdoms. Their mythic epics, kept within deep and hidden crypts below the Priory, recount ancient battles against Oogair over the Oto Apaika, Jutalmank over the western corner and the Agane, against the fringe, scattered tribes of Orhi to the far north, lost eastern factions, and of course great battles with the Athergalth. The Templars of the Heart vehemently hated the Athergalth, since they agreed that the Athergalth was a god, an evil, genocidal one, and that the surrounding forests of the Oogair were a burgeoning blight, meant to choke out the life and civilizations of the Aakow, and this is why they fell the Great Forest and waged war forever upon the Athergalth and its allies. Due to the religious significance of Goythop as Holy Land, many different people from different cultures made rare pilgrimage to Goythop, and a large minority of those within Goythop were not natively born, especially on account of their warlike nature. Goythop was home to people from the Mimicry, the Cult of the Instrument, the Copper Kingdoms, the Far East, and the Warlords of Oogair, who all seemed to make their way to the Priory even though the mentions and presence of Goythop in the Templars of the Heart were seemingly non-existent or nearly so, save in the Eastern Peninsulas and in niche instances in the tales of Oogair and Gyupi. When pilgrims made their way to the Priory, they would perform rites to Achotha itself by smearing themselves in filth and fasting on nothing but dirt and blood. All the while, they would search the extensive caves beneath the Priory of Goythop in a morbid gambit for some degree of enlightenment. If they survived the ordeal, they often stayed in Goythop for the rest of their days, which were often short-lived. Perhaps the old legendary mythic battles of the Templars of the Heart and the trickle of immigrants from otherwise strange and irrelevant locations to Goythop points to an age long past in which these Templars stretched far and wide across the four corners. Even the chained armor and weapons of the more elite units is made of a metal more advanced than what anyone of today could work with, save for the warped metal of the estates. Assuming any of this is true, though such an assumption is quite grand, Goythop and the Templars of the Heart are far past their glory days. To the east of Goythop in the Athergalth are the Twin Peninsulas, also known as God's Feet or simply the Far East. It is a land of sprawling, rolling hills, farmlands, grasslands, streams, sparse forests, common rains, and rocky coasts. To the cartographers of Eathkink and scholars who are geographically inclined, the East is generally seen as the most pleasant climate of the entire continent. The Far East, though lacking in any great conflicts or movements like the cultures in the West, is still a land full of intrigue, unique cultures, and vivid histories. It is there where a peculiar form of civilization ebbs and flows. The Far East is a region not governed by any nation-state or city-state or any manner of king or theocrat, but rather by many scattered and decentralized familial and individual estates, if anything. To best understand the thought process, reasoning, and organization of the Twin Peninsulas and why it is the way that it is, it's best to understand the horribly misunderstood religious values and subsequent cultural beliefs of the Eastern people. To everyone but themselves, the Eastern people are said to either be completely atheist, agnostic, or that they worship Uyura Mareki, also known as selfism, the belief that they themselves are gods. All of these claims are gross misconceptions that further lead to the ostracization of the East by the rest of the people on Uthalpaba, who generally tend to be far more zealous in their faiths. The truth is that they tend to believe in a religion truly known as Ayawapur Mareki, though the Eastern people don't often see their beliefs as being equivalent to a true religion. The basics is that they believe in one singular deity known as Unarish, and that Unarish, when he created the world and the Aakow people upon it, died in the process in a great sacrifice. Now, the soul, the spirit, the Uthur of Unarish lives on through the Aakow. This is why the Aakow, and no other animal, is capable of complex thought, artistic expression, creation, and invention. Within the Ayawapur Mareki faith, the Eastern people do not worship Unarish directly. They do not build temples or read holy texts, because why would they? Their god is dead. Instead, they believe in practicing the gift of creation that was bestowed upon them as the children of the Creator himself. They also believe that, just as they were blessed with creation, so too are they cursed to die like Unarish, and as such they have a limited time to forge their legacy and fulfill their dreams and ambitions. This is one of the main reasons for the great ambitions, ruthless competition, cutthroat intrigue, and rugged individualism of the Twin Peninsulas. There is often contention within the Eastern people to whether or not there are other pieces of Unarish's Oogair that exists either within animals, plants, or in a more non-corporeal form. Assuming parts of his Oogair can exist in an ethereal form, it's believed that just as the Aakow have their own personalities, ambitions, and agencies, so too do the spiritual remnants of Unarish, and that these spiritual remnants have some degree of otherworldly power and are seen in other faiths as the various gods, but that they are nothing more than greater and more powerful spirits and cannot truly be considered as deities. Only Unarish truly holds that title. The Eastern people's belief that there is only a single deity who is ultimately dead, and their lack of any holy texts or obvious forms of worship, is what gives the impression that they are atheistic in nature. On and around the Twin Peninsulas, what a person, or often their entire family, owns, be that a specific tract of land, a building or business of any sort, or any kind of asset, even if it's something as mundane as a shovel or shirt, is deemed as being their estate, and they are the sole authority of how their property is managed. There is no king, governor, senator, or any other kind of government or priestly caste dictating laws or collecting taxes above the authority of an estate. This often meant very little. A simple homeowner in a village or a small farmer likely wouldn't even bother with any sort of politics of this kind, like setting some sort of laws, let alone enforcing them, yet for the larger, wealthier, and influential estates, their authority toed the line of proper governance. The most notable individuals and families of the East made up what can best be described as the nobility of the region, and they often called the shots of what happened on their land from their more literal estate, as in a mansion, chateau, or villa. The size of one's place of residence was an important status symbol on the Twin Peninsulas, and often the larger, grander mansions equated with the power and influence of its residents. The lands of the East were often speckled by almost comically large mansions, some new, some old, most crumbled and ruined. This tends to give an often misinterpreted double meaning to the idea of estate governance. Consider a brief hypothetical. A successful farmer who owns some fertile land decides to use his wealth to build a grand villa upon his property as a symbol. This farmer, who has sole authority of what is done on his land, decides to allow his workers to make their own small houses around his villa for the sake of convenience, as long as they pay a small fee for the use of the land. Now that more people are lumped into this land, the farmer may allow someone to build an inn to house more people and to provide food, drink, and some entertainment, so long as they too pay a fee. Now maybe a blacksmith comes along to mend the tools, or a cobbler to mend work boots, or a weaver to make and mend clothes, or a baker to turn the wheat the farmer grows into flour, then bread. And now far more people are congregated upon the farmer's land, making it a target to more malicious groups. As such, the farmer may now have to use his wealth to hire mercenaries to guard his property. Crime may now become a minor issue, so the farmer may now outlaw swords or even alcohol on his property to cut down on altercation. The farmer may also prohibit hunting on his property, or charge a fee for merchants to use the road on his land, etc. Now, the once farmer has instead accidentally created a small town and became a minor lord of sorts, collecting tax in the form of rent, setting rules for what can and cannot be done on his sovereign property, and hiring mercenaries to act as a standing army for enforcing and protecting from outside forces. This is how towns and villages worked in the East. Estates, large or small, were often judged by how generational the family estate was, not just because older estates tended to be the wealthiest, most stable, and most successful, but because estates had a tendency not to last long, and wealth could be lost just as quickly as gained. Families and individuals die out over time, new competition rises, mercenaries or roving gangs of bandits may kick down your door, or if you're too ambitious, local estates may hire assassins or form coalitions and confederacies against you. This also applies if an estate was engaging in unsocially acceptable behavior. Technically, on your own estate you could butcher people and engage in cannibalism if you so chose, or any other such distasteful actions, but in practicality, if anybody was caught engaging in such behaviors, they were often killed quickly and without remorse as more of an overarching cultural rule. There were many checks and balances to the power structure of the East, and most of it was horribly cutthroat, yet the downfall of an estate was a gap to be filled by new ambition. In the absence of centralized governance and a proper, stable noble class, the warrior caste took a prominent role in society. Where standing armies couldn't be raised, soldiers instead could be purchased to guard towns or wage wars on other estates, and the largest armies were easily those of mercenary companies, whose power stretched far across the east. Wars were often fought not by the individual members of an estate, but by these third parties. Leaders of these mercenary companies were some of the wealthiest estates in the east. They often toed the line with being a part of the merchant class instead on account of their wealth and the nature of their service. Leaders of mercenary estates often never even appeared in battle themselves, but instead they engaged much more in tactics, management, and accounting. On the less savory side of the warrior caste, roving bands of raider, pirate, and bandit warlords often led explosive but short-lived lives, taking what they wanted by force. Save for the mercenary groups, nothing could stand in the way of their brutality and numbers. When this happened, estates often formed coalitions and confederacies to pool resources to raise what little of a fighting force that they could, or to hire more mercenaries. Fortunately, the mercenary gangs often outmanned and outarmed the bandits, so the more civilized sections of the Twin Peninsulas rarely saw conflict of this kind, save for pirates that constantly disrupted trade. But even then, there were many mercenary groups that specialized in naval warfare, who were often hired to guard convoys of merchant ships and ports. Though the warrior caste was of extreme importance and power in the East, undeniably the merchant class was the most influential, and the sophistication of Eastern economics, even during the Twilight era, was staggering. Merchant caravans and trade routes were extensive. Metal was taken from Gyupi, Oogair, and the other lesser copper kingdoms of the Oogair Mountains. Lumber was taken from the Aakow. Agricultural products were taken from the Toyat River. Cattle, sheep, goats, and other animals grazed in the rolling hills, producing various animal products. Fish were taken from the coast, and so on. All of these raw materials were funneled into the more urban regions of God's Feet, where vast industries would work on refining these goods. The merchants would then take these refined goods and sell them back to the farmers, miners, lumberjacks, fishermen, and so forth all across the East, creating a fairly reliable and lucrative back-and-forth trade relationship between the rural and urban sections of the East. Where being so decentralized, much of the Eastern industry was concentrated into very few places. The East also had economic practices still rarely seen elsewhere. Cereal production, fractional investment in ships and other businesses, convoy tactics on both land and sea, standardized parts and measurements, and so forth. All of this turned the Far East into an economic and industrial hotspot in the best of times, but the constant instability and lawlessness had a tendency to curtail much of the potential. But the barter system still generally reigned supreme in most areas. The East also had a few different currencies being used that no doubt contributed to the smooth growth and transfer of wealth. On the coast, they used specific kinds of seashells. Around the Oogair they would use tally sticks. On the northern peninsula, they used special green beads, and around the Oogair Mountains, they would use lumps of raw metal. Despite a few different working currencies, the large merchant groups would often compensate, honor, and adapt to these changes, lessening the issues and allowing for constant trade despite the differences. Of all of the different organized groups in the Twin Peninsulas, none were greater than the elusive Cult of Eternal War. This odd cult was a mercenary company with scattered chapters all throughout the Twin Peninsulas. These different chapters, despite sharing the same symbolism and intent, had rarely any direct affiliation and communication with each other, making each chapter largely independent of one another. The largest of these chapters was located on the island fortress of Azalseek, the unofficial headquarters of the Cult of Eternal War. Azalseek was an impenetrable bastion from invasion, but for trade and diplomacy, it was wide open for all. Merchant ships would come to trade frequently on the island, and the more wealthy estates would often come to hire them to conduct warfare or even to mediate issues. In the center of the island of Azalseek was a large metal statue depicting a woman, a pseudo-deity named Oogair, a figure who was less of a proper goddess and more of a personification of war and luck. Whenever a member of the Eternal War cult is asked who their leader is, they always claim it's Oogair, and many of the female chapter leaders often take up the name of Oogair as more of a title, often in mild jest. Within stories told by the cult of Eternal War and the Twin Peninsulas at large, Oogair is often mentioned in stories relating to warfare as an embodiment of war, even though no Oogair was ever present. The aesthetic of the cult of Eternal War is also rather unique, with their armors often being spiked with large needle-like additions, and they always wear combinations of red, yellow, and blue. They also use often tessellating symbols of teardrops and feminine motifs as a reference to Oogair, with many members of the cult of Eternal War carrying with them carved figures of Oogair as a token of good luck. The Eternal War cult seems to have no apparent motive, and they can be seen fighting with or against local estates, small or large, paid or otherwise, for no explained motive save for the love of battle. It's not uncommon for members of the cult to appear unannounced in battles without invitation, nor is it uncommon for different chapters of the cult to fight each other on different sides of the same conflict. Even lone individuals in the cult often travel to the east, offering their services to anyone who may request it. The cult of Eternal War also has a special religious artifact known as the Lucky Sword of the Spider, a sword given to Oogair by an unknown individual on the Toyot River in exchange for some food. The spider mentioned in the sword is usually connected to a certain deity in Toyot River myths who is a divine figure of chaos and fear. Many also equate the spider to being Oogair herself, but reinterpreted by a separate culture. Either way, the Far Eastern people, and even the Eternal War cult, don't even widely believe in these deities. The Lucky Sword of the Spider was an artifact that changed many hands throughout history, and it has a mythic and unexplained status similar to Oogair in the way in which they both appear without explanation in old stories. The cult of Eternal War is also believed to have existed for a very, very long time, with their symbols and colors being found scattered all across ancient ruins on the Twin Peninsulas, even on skeletons in ancient and largely untouched ruins. Even though the intentions of the Eternal War cult seem scattered, illogical, and bland, they have had an invested interest in the lost city of Mythoclast, which they invaded several times both before and after the destruction of the ancient city. Rumors and speculation claims that certain powerful members of the cult of Eternal War used the mechanisms within the towers of Mythoclast to ordain and even change the outcomes of the future and to speak to powerful deities to an unknown end. Even after the eventual rise and fall of the Far East during the Dawn era, this elusive group always remains in some way. Though the East was so decentralized, there were 3 places in the Twilight era that could adequately be called cities: the Aakow, Achotha, and Mythoclast. The creation of the Aakow is a rather underwhelming one, caused merely by ideal geography. Where the main body of Achotha breaks off into the Ormuriged Peninsula, the land briefly thins out into a sort of causeway, making it the only viable path of travel between Ormuriged and the rest of the continent by land. This, coupled with lucrative fishing industries and thus ports on either end of the region, made it a perfect trade hub. Merchants, armies, and any other travelers in the region would go back and forth through the causeway, making it a prominent trade hub both on land and on the water. People just naturally flocked to the Aakow and stayed around, building houses, starting industries, etc. There was never one specific moment or pivotal founder. The Aakow just gradually happened. There wasn't ever a single Aakow either. Rather, there were many smaller nearby settlements that gradually grew together into becoming a major city. Thanks to their mercantile history, the Aakow trade routes became very sophisticated, and it became a haven for artisans and skilled laborers who would use imported raw goods to produce all manner of finished products to be exported back, creating a much-needed industrial center and lucrative back-and-forth trade that helped not only develop the Aakow, but anybody else within its economic influence. Due to the nature of the Aakow in the east as a whole, the city was almost comically decentralized. From block to block and road to road, the ruling estate and thus governance would change. Laws were largely non-existent and shifted constantly, with the one constant being a loose meritocracy and no-nonsense cultural undertones that frowned heavily upon any manner of murder, theft, and so forth, especially when such crimes were often met with whatever kind of punishment the offended or the paid mercenary guards wished. The Inner Reach was so decentralized that depending on which part of the city you were in, entire cultures and even languages would change. Walking through the city often felt like walking through multiple cities at once, as if multiple places were plucked from existence and squished into one place. The only binding tradition of the Inner Reach is the lighting of the East Star, a strange mechanism of glass, mirrors, and glass pipes, all jutting from a single fireplace. The fire in the fireplace, according to tradition, may never, under any circumstance, go out, though the people who adhered to the tradition long since forgot why. The glass and mirrors were all said to accentuate and scatter the light of the fire, lighting up the city even at night. Other than the Inner Reach, there was also Achotha, a much more traditional city. Achotha itself existed for quite a while in a small and insignificant state, and it wouldn't be a prominent location until Auyamau, a prominent warlord, conquered it and made it his new home. Auyamau was notoriously proficient in two types of spears, the first to end life and the other to create it, and he is known mostly not for his proclivities for warfare, but for his many children. Auyamau instilled into his many children a deep love and appreciation for family, and encouraged them, no matter what they wished to do in life, to stick together and help one another. Even once Auyamau died and his children grew up and split off, the Auyamau estate stood strong. His children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would all become mercenaries, merchants, farmers, shepherds, fishermen, milliners, masons, cobblers, coopers, and any other sort of profession, yet they all stuck together. The city of Achotha remained a city very firmly under the control of the Auyamau estate, with no possible opposition, even as it grew into a wealthy and populous city. The Auyamau family became the only Grand Eastern dynasty, and they always kept track of their bloodline and family tree, starting with Auyamau himself. Although many other minor estates existed in Achotha, none dare oppose anyone if they were in the Auyamau estate, whose words were law both within Achotha and the immediate area around it. Unlike the rest of the East, Achotha's nepotism and strong familial union made it the only mostly centralized region on all of the Twin Peninsulas, a boon that made them very strong even past the Twilight Era and into the Dawn Era. The last major city of the Far East during the Twilight Era was much more elusive, that being the city of Mihimel. Mihimel rose and fell far back during the Twilight Era, but few, often embellished records remain. Built on the easternmost point of Utaupaba, the city was not of the same culture as the rest of the Twin Peninsulas. It's said that the people of Mihimel built towers of stone and iron, with glittering designs of jade and aquamarine built in imitation of the jade towers. They also had sophisticated mechanisms of gears, cogs, and axles in these great towers that were said to alter the course of time and receive communication from gods, and many of their cultural motifs, including any tools, armor, weapons, furniture, and jewelry, had strong mechanical symbols and shapes, even if they didn't function in any sophisticated manner. The exact fate of Mihimel isn't entirely certain, but most accounts claim that Mihimel was either destroyed in a great battle or that it sunk into the sea, even sometimes both at the same time, and even the eastern people, who aren't prone to fanciful tales, claim a serpentine or squid-like leviathan dragged the city into the sea. Though Mihimel was wiped off the map, many of its spires remain jutting out of the ocean, and many years after the city was originally destroyed, many of the towers were reclaimed. The upper portions of the towers were gutted of anything valuable and turned into homes, while the lower, waterlogged portions still remain untouched to this day. Around these towers, platforms of planks and pontoons allowed for traversal between, and a large settlement, although not very influential, was rebuilt on its remains. In the Far East, there is also a worrisome concept known as the city on city, or city on city on city. The East, as is to be expected by the rise and fall of the many scattered estates, is filled up with ruins. Old stonework litters the landscape, overgrown, crumbling, and long since abandoned. Yet among these ruins are some that seem much older, much more ancient, much more sophisticated, and of a distinctly separate culture. Yet their origins are unaccounted for, and their breadth and scale are seemingly much larger than anything the fragmented East could realistically create. There are also theories that say the aforementioned cities were all built atop of other, even more ancient cities, thus the name of the city on city. For instance, both the Inuit and Achotha have spiraling, maze-like catacombs beneath their cities that are neither mapped nor accounted for. Even the East Star doesn't have a known origin or reasoning behind it, despite it being in an Inuit tradition, and many of the glass pipes and mirrors shine into sections of the underground tunnels of the city that have long since been blocked off, abandoned, and unaccounted for. The East also used what they called warped metal, the Eastern name of what we now know as iron and steel, two types of metal impossible to fully work with during the Twilight Era due to a lack of knowledge on the processes needed to melt them down. Ancient warped metal goods were scavenged from old ruins or found buried in fields and repurposed. These metal goods were then, since they cannot be melted down without significant difficulty, instead stripped of the rust, and the dents and nicks were then pounded out as straight as possible or intentionally worsened. What was once a substantial chunk taken from a sword was now part of a serrated edge, or now that sword was instead a dagger. What was once a dented helmet was now instead a bowl. The possibilities seemed only greater with the limitations that the metal brought. These refurbished metal pieces could generally be a bit weak and hard to use on account of their unideal manufacturing, or rather refurbishing process, but they sufficed well enough considering that the much more practical copper and tin from the Oogair Mountains was halfway across the continent. Even to this day, Eastern goods are often serrated, wavy, and lumpy as if they were broken and fixed, or are scratched into patterns like a crude form of embossment, all as a cultural remnant from the days of warped metal. Far to the west of the Twin Peninsulas, within the southern Oogair Mountains, was another Twilight-era culture known broadly as the Copper Kingdoms. Though still a term used today, even if much less so, the Copper Kingdoms was the name of the broad and various groups of southern Uthapaba, who are known, as the name implies, for being the only reliable supply of copper and other raw metals during the Twilight Era and the early portions of the Dawn Era. The term Copper Kingdoms wasn't what they referred to themselves as at all. Rather, it was an overarching name given to them by the Amer or Urhij, the dominant power throughout most of the Dawn Era. In reality, the Copper Kingdoms could be split into many different cultural groups, and within those, multiple tribal monarchies and city-states with their own motives, rulers, alliances, and microcultures, who are all often allied with or vassalized by one another. Of these Copper Kingdoms, the two most major cities in their respective cultures were Oogair with Oikumiakishao and Gyupi with Introspection. Nestled northwest in the Copper Kingdoms among the cold, stony peaks of the Oogair Mountains, Oogair was known for many things. The hardworking tenacity of its people, their often loud, bombastic, and confident personalities, its thriving mining, smithing, and forging industries, its sprawling subterranean district, its reputation as a city of the arts, and its intricate and fantastical stories and legends relayed through prose and poetry and song. On the Oogair's surface, its more colorful elements were lesser known, but from a distance, the city appeared to be a small, snow-covered stone city whose size was betrayed by its underground segments and whose color palette consisted of gray and white with harsh metallic accents. As you neared the city, you heard the chimes, bells, gongs, and harmonic singing blasting through the streets, whose walls were adorned with colorful paintings and carvings representing past people and events from old legends. Even the architecture becomes more impressive as you study it, for its austere precision and complex engravings are emblematic of masterful masons and stoneworkers. The people all adorned their hair and facial hair with bells and chimes and wore jewelry of a similar nature. They played instruments and sang on balconies and porches. Groups of performers marched through the streets, singing hymns and epics for donations. Their tools and weapons were made with small holes in them, so that they whistled when used. The Oogair art didn't stop with music. They also loved to engage in theatrical plays. These plays were often quite brutal and to most others far too realistic. For if a character in the play was meant to be harmed or even killed, the actor would have that inflicted on them, making acting a death sentence much of the time. Prisoners and slaves were often forced into acting out these events as a form of punishment and execution. The alternative would be forced labor until death, which was often viewed as a less desirable outcome. Many of these plays and much of the music created by Oogair would be performed abroad for other cultures, primarily the Parama Mereki, where they would create amphitheaters to stage their arts for the people. Most of the musical instruments and theatrics of southwestern cultures in Uthapapa can all be tied back in some manner to Oogair. The king of Oogair, for as long as is known, always wore the same crown generation after generation, though to call it a crown is a disservice. The apparatus upon the mountain monarch's head was a brass contraption of bells and whistles that, though generously padded inside, crushed the head of the king. It rested not just upon the head, but down onto the shoulders and uppermost back as a metal behemoth. From out of the top, slotted cylinders like flutes of varying lengths and width jutted into the air that played in the cool wind. It's said that the winds were Uther spirits that sang to the king words of ancestral wisdom as a lullaby of the lamented. It is also said that the wisest men in Oogair could even judge the time, day, and seasons based on the sound of the city alone, and many of the major decisions, including the placement of every coveted mine, were left up to the whims of dowsing rods that professed the will of the ground with pulsing vibrations. The city itself was even said to be deafening at the best of times, with parades and celebrations being loud enough to level the tops of mountains and be heard as far as the Amaroru Mound. This is one explanation for the many underground sections of the city, that the sounds from the surface would be deafened and dissipated by the time they reached the lower dwellings. Much of these cultural tendencies can be explained by the beliefs of Oigumia-Gishaw, the main cultural/religious system of Oogair. They believe that their god Urthalth sings and drums the world of Achotha into existence, and that his godly songs and tales are the stories of the past, present, and future. They believe that sound is the most fundamental and powerful force and building block of Achotha, and more metaphysically, so are stories themselves. Without stories, histories, and legends, there is nothing. It is stories that cement the world into existence, keeping it real, tangible, and growing, and that with each new verse of Urthalth's song, new legends and events are sung into reality to keep Achotha grounded and stable. The people of Oigumia-Gishaw emulate Urthalth's creation by making their own tales and stories, viewing it as Urthalth creating through them as a proxy, as if they are a background instrument, adding their own depth and flavor to the bass drumming and lyrics of the world's song. In theory, this should mean that the people of Oogair should have a bountiful record of past histories and events of the Twilight Era, and this is true, though with a major caveat. Oogair culture believes that the most important elements of any kind of story is not its truth and accuracy, but its moral and lesson. They expect and even encourage embellishments, omissions, additions, symbolisms, metaphors, and allegories all throughout their records, written or oral, so long as these clever lies, half-truths, and double meanings further the intended takeaway of the story. It doesn't help that there are many stories happening simultaneously, or made only within the context of another story, only for them to contradict and lead to paradoxes. This makes understanding the history of Oogair convoluted and sometimes outrightly impossible, requiring years of scholarly research and an intimate knowledge of local customs to begin to understand. The other major city-state, Gyupi, had a much different culture. Located southeast of Oogair, less in the mountains themselves and more in the neighboring highlands, Gyupi's extensive mining efforts and its mostly unmapped and uncovered cave networks made it a formidable opponent in the race for raw metals. Gyupi's long loyal vassal of Azuthimi also gave them an agrarian and fishing edge, and Gyupi's broader focus on animal husbandry and shepherds gave them a surplus in a region otherwise difficult to get reliable food. The people of Gyupi were also renowned for their masterful stoneworkers and masons, whose statues, architectures, and even stone shipyards were unique and awe-inspiring. Gyupi was also masterful in their use of ceramics. They had concoctions of materials that, when properly fired, were stronger than any known metal and white as bone. Their ceramics were used for practically everything. Various tools, day-to-day household items, decorations, building materials, weapons and armor, and more. Gyupi soldiers were visually distinct due to their heavy use of ceramic. Their armor was shaped in a way to look as if it were made of bone, their helmets like skulls, and the space between the ceramic plates were held together by many red-dyed ropes that allowed for flexibility and protection and looked like muscles and sinew. Gyupi ceramic was far more expensive than the copper they were known for, but nonetheless it was still a major export in Gyupi society. Gyupi also took inspiration from Oogair, adopting their love for music. Many of the cultural motifs and symbolism of Gyupi were sound-based, and though those of introspection rarely wore the bells and chimes of Oogair, they still stomped their feet, drummed their bellies, clapped their hands, and sang oral traditions and what they called skin songs, and since the only instrument needed was the self, anybody could participate. The people of Gyupi were most known, not for their mining, agriculture, architecture, masonry, or whatever else, but for introspection, a cultural/religious practice seen by most foreigners outside the Copper Kingdoms as profane, evil, and inspired by the more demonic Oogair spirits. Introspection, in short, is the belief that Achotha itself is a god of death, flesh, mortality, challenge, and sacrifice, and that the Aakow are all his children, for they were created in his death. This belief, though peculiar, is not what invokes the ire of neighboring peoples, but rather it's their peculiar form of worship. They believe that in order to understand not just themselves, but Achotha too, they must engage in literal, physical introspection, in which they carve into their flesh with knives or other sharp implements, permanently scarring upon their skin words, symbols, proverbs, and names. They do this as a permanent reminder of lessons learned in life. They believe that pain, suffering, and punishment are the best forms of learning and growing, and that by inflicting themselves with scars and pain, they also inflict scars upon their minds, molding and shaping their inner and outer beings into something greater. This practice was bloody and permanently disfigured adherents of introspection, especially during the Twilight era, when it seems that more ancient introspection focused on inflicting as much pain and suffering upon themselves as physically possible. Ancient introspection even seems to have had some cannibalistic tendencies, and they'd even ecstatically rub dirt and filth into their scarred wounds to further their misery. Likely on account of their faith, Gyupi and the wider introspection-worshipping Copper Kingdoms had a relatively advanced amount of knowledge on biology and medicine, paradoxically making introspection a faith that increased their lifespans overall, at least for those who survived their scarification rituals. Worthy of note is also the matter of slavery. The Copper Kingdoms were the most prolific slavers on all of Uthapaba, perhaps ever. They purchased many slaves, primarily from the tribes of Ortegal and Antithesis, a mark against the culture all the way up to the Dusk era. While it's true that most people included slavery in their culture in some way or form, be them as prisoners, war spoils, or debt bonded, the extent of slavery in the Copper Kingdoms was abysmal. Slavery was prevalent in every of the kingdoms, especially the wealthiest and most influential of them. Best case scenario, the slaves worked back-breaking labor, breathing in the underground dust until they went blind and their lungs turned black before being crushed by rubble and mine collapses, and in the worst case scenario, they were experimented on in deep dungeons in Gyupi, where slaves were dissected alive and studied to further understand anatomy and affliction. The true extent of these torturous experiments is unknown, for the records were stricken or hidden by later, more civilized descendants, but what is known is that the fates of these unlucky slaves were worse than any other on Achotha. Their deaths weren't in vain, however, for this is likely one of the reasons for the second-to-none medical and anatomical knowledge of Gyupi, and practically the entirety of Aakow biology was founded by Gyupi, including many fields of embibetics. Despite modern sensibilities viewing Gyupi slavery as barbaric and horrid, the people of Gyupi viewed it as benevolent. They had the view that, if somebody is unwilling to be productive willingly, they should be made productive unwillingly and have their lives be put to a pragmatic and beneficial use. This warped thinking was likely encouraged further by Gyupi's reverence for labor and hard work in general, especially as a more mild form of their introspection practices. In terms of the Copper Kingdom's historical significance during the Twilight era, it can be difficult to discern, but based on Oogair oral traditions, writings inscribed onto statues and walls in Gyupi, in the works of the philosopher and historian Oogair, a few events can be vaguely gleamed. Trade records point towards frequent trade with Horjan and the Prama-Mereki. There's evidence of wars between the Copper Kingdoms, including a major conflict in which Urthalthink, once the dominant power of the Copper Kingdoms, was defeated by Oogair, who then replaced Urthalthink as a dominant power in the region. And there are records of conflicts with the tribes of Antithesis, the tribes of Oogair, the tribes of the Toyat River, and even potentially a major conflict on the Oto-Apa'ika between the Copper Kingdoms, the Prama-Mereki, a now lost city named Ajuma-Pur, and the Templars of the Heart against Oogair, that ended in a bloody but decisive victory for the Copper Kingdoms. Unfortunately, not much more than these broad strokes can be said, and even some of these points, such as the aforementioned war against Oogair, aren't even entirely concrete due to Oogair's proclivity to embellish and undoubtedly make themselves appear more just. It wouldn't be until much later into the Dawn Era, with the works of Oogair and the eventful rise of King Achikani, that the records and centralization of the Copper Kingdoms would occur. To the southwest of the Copper Kingdoms was debatably the most important group of the Dawn Era, the Prama-Mereki. The Prama-Mereki people of the Twilight Era were not so grand, but in hindsight, it's possible to see glimpses of the people they'd become even in their more primitive state. The Prama-Mereki of Twilight were centered around the ruined city of the Amor-Umaun, also known as the Prama-Or-Umaun, from which a great statue stood at its center. This grand statue was old, decayed, sand and rain battered, and difficult to discern, but at the right angles, it appeared to be a great king. The Prama-Mereki worshipped this great kingly figure as a god known as the Prama, the All-King, a hero god of ambition, governance, man, and order. The Prama-Mereki people believed that on very rare occasions, the Prama has and will manifest himself upon Achotha as a man or woman called the Herkawingu in order to achieve great feats to advance the Aakow people in some way and or to thwart great threats to Achotha. They also believed that, just as their god comes to Achotha as a mortal, so too can a mortal ascend and achieve apotheosis to become a piece of the Prama through accomplishing great feats. The distinction between god to man from man to god is generally seen as arbitrary among the Prama-Mereki, with them viewing any given Herkawingu as paradoxically both. They also believe that the gods from other religions are either outright nonsense or other cultural interpretations of the various Herkawingu. Within the Prama-Mereki, each Herkawingu is represented by a symbolic animal or some other similar motif, the best known nowadays being King Ashekar II, who is represented by avian and sun motifs, and Yuma-Uki the Tideborn, represented broadly by fish. Many people see the old Prama-Mereki people as animal worshippers or ancestor worshippers, which isn't entirely true, but not too far off either. Regardless of cultural motif, the Prama-Mereki tribes operated in what was essentially a tribal empire, a strange oxymoron. The numerous tribes were all organized by a tribal ruler who lived within certain territories that were notably not nomadic, for such an idea was forbidden due to a cultural affinity for the land. However, a few certain occupations like shepherds were allowed to operate between the boundaries of each tribe. Boundaries that were not very well guarded or laid out, and often only decided vaguely by certain landmarks. Many of these small tribal lands were impoverished, especially the landlocked ones. However, others were much better, such as the coastal tribes or those with old ruins. On the topic of old ruins, the lands of the Prama-Mereki were oddly littered with several major sandstone ruins. The aforementioned Prama-Or-Umaun was one such ruin, another was the city of Amor-Zich, which is now Umavant, another was then the Uwuma-Ukimiu Kirk, but is now the city of Ayukchishu, and the last major one being the Uyir-Ki-Aunio-Ahukar, which is now the Chamaunu-Ahukar, or Urzen-Pernt. This same architectural style of ruins is also seen under the city of Jirauk and on the Oto-Apa'ika, implying that whoever these ancient people were, they were quite far spread. The most likely theory is that these ruins were once the thriving cities of Oogair, or adjacently related to the even older Ajuma-Pur and the Children of the Mirror. Despite the shady origin of these ancient structures, the ones in the hands of the Prama-Mereki were seen as the sacred ground of their ancestors, and tribal monarchs often controlled these territories. reusing what structures they could and making new structures out of sticks, fir, and adobe. The most important of these ruins was of course the Prama or Umaun, from which the, what was essentially emperor, reigned under the title of Prama, an honorary title that carried into the age of nation-states and implied a semi-godly status and ordainment from the heavens. The ruling Prama emperor would often settle disputes, make laws to the other tribes, raise armies if need be, wage war, collect tribute as tax, and organize funding campaigns for tribes in distress, such as those in famine. Despite the odd governing structure being way more akin to normal nation-states than any other tribal people, the Prama Mimicry were still extremely primitive. They only used stone, bone, and wood tools, with some exceptions, didn't know how to irrigate, though they did farm slightly around the coast and the Jana Urcha. They weren't literally the Prama. Despite their seemingly complicated governing structure, it really doesn't appear as if they actually understood what any of it meant, but rather it appeared to be a reverent mimicry based off of their values, God, and ideas taken from the properly sophisticated neighboring Oogair. The relationship between the Prama Mimicry peoples and Oogair is mildly peculiar, and it seems as if these two people had a love-hate relationship. Considering how long these groups must have known each other, that's understandable since things change, but it leads to seemingly contradictory accounts on the relationship between these two. On the positive end, the Prama Mimicry recount tales of when the Oogair people arrived from the east, and how the Oogair taught them how to farm and to love the color green. It seems these two groups also traded extensively with one another and were allies in conflicts with the northern tribes of Antithesis. On the negative end, it seems these two also fought each other quite a lot, for old Oogair stories tell of strangely yet worryingly large and organized tribes from the east that raided and pillaged settlements and cities, taking tools, food, and slaves. And even older tales tell of how the Prama Mimicry, the Copper Kingdoms, the Jumapur, and the Templars of the Heart fought back Oogair in an epic war to retake the southernmost corner of Uthapaba. Unfortunately, much of the old culture of the Prama Mimicry was lost over time. The Prama Mimicry would become the Emma or Urhij and then the Aushaku Emma or Urhij early in the Dawn era, and this large kingdom would come to conquer many other cultures. But just as the later Prama Mimicry people imposed their culture on their conquered peoples, so too did these conquered people impose their own culture on the Prama Mimicry. The Prama or Umaun, the capital of this kingdom, was known for being a burgeoning multicultural city with people from plenty of different walks of life, and the Prama Mimicry adopted many of these motifs, straying far from their original path, making it much harder to tell how exactly they were in more ancient times. To the west of the Prama Mimicry was arguably the most influential and sophisticated civilization of the Twilight era, Oogair, also known as Lost Oogair, to differentiate the Oogair of early history from the Oogair of later, a separation drawn firmly at the War of Fratricide, which occurred merely 50 years into the Dawn era. Although similar in practically every aspect other than territorial holdings and a newfound hatred against Amishgog, only the history of the old and lost Oogair is of concern here. Unfortunately, like their northern sister nation Jitaumank, the people of Oogair are oddly and frustratingly intent on the ideas of radical historic revision. Combine this with the near destruction of all of Oogair by King Asheka II and Oogair's so far indecipherable chronology, and getting any kind of historic retelling is impossible. Despite the lack of an ideal amount of information surrounding Oogair, what is known is rather peculiar. It's known that Oogair had very strong ties to Jitaumank despite the considerable distance between the two, and that these two nations were very similar. They shared the same religion, that of the Gardener's cult. They shared the same affinity for history, writing, and flora. They shared a similar degree of technology and governance. They traded frequently with one another with the help of merchant fleets that sailed unopposed thanks to the lack of any other civilizations between them, and they had similar racial characteristics. Other than Jitaumank, it's believed based off of old legends, proximity, and similar beliefs, that Oogair had slight yet mutually beneficial dealings with the crab cult to their north along the coast, as well as a much more defined connection to the eastern Prama Mimicry people. Oogair seems to have had a generally positive relationship with the Prama Mimicry tribal monarchies. Oogair gave the Prama Mimicry technology in exchange for manpower and mutually beneficial trade, which undoubtedly led to a far more advanced Pramamereki people capable of agriculture and other pivotal discoveries. The two even fought with one another against the northern tribes of Antithesis during what seems to have been a large, major conflict over the Jana Urcha during an uncertain date. There are also theories and ideas that the people of Oogair were at one point in ancient history far more spread out than what they were as of the time of their downfall. They may even have controlled much of the Pramamereki land, considering that the ancient ruins that the Pramamereki worship are otherwise unexplained, and that they at one point controlled as far southeast as the Oto-Apaika and parts of what are now the Copper Kingdoms, if the old tales are to be believed of an ancient battle that took place at the culturally important region where Oogair fought a long and bloody conflict against the Copper Kingdoms, the Templars of the Heart, the Jumapur, and the Pramamereki, despite their otherwise mutual like for one another. The legend of this battle from every perspective recounts of the resounding defeat of Oogair and their expulsion from the Oto-Apaika. Other than what little is known of the history of Oogair, their culture is quite well known due to its perseverance into the modern day. The people of Oogair always held the belief that by knowing someone's identity, specifically their name and face, that you hold power over them. As such, they always hid their names and faces. They hid their names by naming their children secret names that only the child and the parents knew, and the child would be given a more literal title later in life to represent their personalities or accomplishments, such as King Is-Unj, the last king of Oogair. The most trusted individuals in a person's life would also often know their name, for sharing your name with someone was a great act of trust, only to be done in the most reverent of moments. They also hid their faces to all but those closest to them, and instead they wore masks and shrouds nearly perpetually, hiding their faces from everyone. The masks were, and still are, seen as an integral piece of clothing and jewelry, and the masks were often formed into various shapes and/or were embossed and painted with cultural and religious motifs. To the people of Oogair, showing your face was seen not just as a great act of trust, but it was also seen as extremely intimate, as if showing their faces was equivalent to seeing them completely naked. Oogair also had a cultural fascination with plants and the color green more specifically, as a symbol of time and life. Oogair had sophisticated irrigation, farming, and plumbing systems that to this day are still unmatched, and the deserts southeast of the Athwart River were once claimed to have been lush, wet, and almost swamp-like during the height of their civilization. Still to this day, stone and sandstone paths of water meant for irrigation cut across the region, and the ancient cities of Oogair were said to be overgrown and more plant than structure. All the old accounts make it seem as if one of the major societal goals of Oogair was to essentially eradicate the western desert, viewing it as a blight from the sun. It's even within Pramamereki fables that they were taught how to love the color green by Oogair, a sentence believed to be an allegory for the knowledge of farming and irrigation, but also perhaps something a bit more philosophical. Other than the fascination with plants and identities, Oogair also had a fascination with time, and the ancient city of Umaun was home to an important artifact known as the Hourglass. According to legend, the Hourglass was created when the city of Umaun, which is also claimed to have been the first city, was first settled. The Hourglass was a large glass contraption set on a pivot in the middle, and whenever somebody died in Oogair, they would be cremated and a single piece of their ashes were put into the Hourglass. Two keepers would perpetually turn the Hourglass, flipping it upside down until every piece of ash fell to the other side. This flipping was the basis for their entire system of time. Considering that as the nation grew larger and larger and spanned further in time, the spinning of the Hourglass became longer and longer between, and so the chronology of Oogair is complete nonsense. The time between spins got exponentially larger over time, but the dates given are complete nonsense and open to all kinds of conjecture. The Hourglass, despite the confusion it put upon the culture, was seen as the most important artifact of the entirety of Oogair, for it supposedly held the Uther spirit of every person's ash put into it. As of the end of Oogair civilization, which happened incredibly early in the Dawn Era, a schism was boiling over in the country, leading to a civil war between the eastern and western halves. The exact nature of this conflict is believed to be not just a succession crisis, but also a long brewing religious feud between a much more traditional faction who occupied the east and a more radical western faction whose beliefs became influenced by the neighboring faiths of antithesis. Unfortunately for both of these sides, the arrival of King Asheka II of Aakow from the north spelled the doom of the already weakened and fragmented nation of Oogair. The hourglass was destroyed by King Asheka II during his rampage throughout Oogair, and the great and ancient nation as a whole was completely turned to rubble. Years later, many of the survivors would return to Oogair, the capital city, and rebuild it after the conflict when King Asheka II and his exiles left the area and laid claim to the Ihai Urcha. The city of Oogair is the last of their ancient empire, and in its place rose the cult of Unima'u and Parama-Mereki nations of the south, who replaced their cultural dominance of the Athwart River region. To the north of Lost Oogair along the Athwart River was Aakow, the last of the Twilight Era civilizations. Aakow, and more broadly Horjan, were river-based tribal civilizations between the Athwart River and the Zaki River. There were 5 tribes in Aakow: Ushu, Juhijink, Damuk, Itherud, and Aakow itself, while Horjan was its own separate large tribe. These 6 tribes worshipped a deity known as Unima'u, an avian god of light, fire, temperance, dusk and dawn, life and death, and that Unima'u was supposedly a living, though silent god who lived on Mount Chea'u, the highest mountain in the Oogair Mountains. The tribes were all ruled by an elder council of an elder from each of the 5 tribes of Aakow, but not Horjan, and they ruled as a theocratic oligarchy over the people of Aakow. These elders were based within the small city of Aakow, located where modern-day Aakow still stands at the intersection of the Athwart River and the Horjan River. The Elder Council of Aakow, despite having a negative reputation, more as a result of propaganda and unlucky history rather than incompetence or evil, was generally a beloved and respected piece of Aakow society. Each Elder Counselor essentially served as the sovereign of their respective tribe, and would only meet together in Aakow City to discuss trade, diplomacy, and religious issues as a collective, so that they could better direct their respective tribes and the cult of Unima'u as a whole. The Elder Counselors were viewed as hierophants and mediators, interpreting and studying the will of Unima'u for the benefit of greater society. Becoming an Elder Counselor was generally a hereditary matter, with every replacement being the son of the previous, with rare exceptions. This doesn't mean that the position was just handed to the son, for before becoming an Elder Counselor, they would have to undergo a rigorous series of rituals and tests to prepare them for and ensure that they were worthy of the position. Heirs were often prepared for the majority of their young life to undergo these trials and fill that position due to how strenuous and dangerous they were. The city of Aakow was still rather advanced for its time. They had sandstone and wooden buildings, copper tools and weapons from the Oogair Mountains, farms and agriculture thanks to lush land around the rivers, governance thanks to the Elder Council, fishing boats, and so forth, even if the city was used mostly as a location for the tribes to congregate for religious rituals and advice from the Elder Council. The rituals of more ancient Aakow were quite brutal and almost similar to the ideals of introspection in terms of cruelty. The people of Aakow had an affinity for fire and the sun, and would often sacrifice dissenters and kidnapped foreign tribesmen to burn in fires to Unima'u, or to force them to watch the sun until they were completely blind, or burnt them with hot copper, branding them as slaves. Seeing burn marks on someone in Aakow was a common sight to behold. They also had a cultural affinity for warm colors. They only ever wore shades of red, yellow, orange, and white, and they shunned any other colors, viewing anything else as superstitious. Horjan, despite sharing a similar faith, were far less extreme in their ideals, which is likely one of the major reasons why the people of Horjan were generally outcasted and seen as lesser by the more radical people of Aakow. The people of Aakow and Horjan were much more outwardly active during the Twilight Era than they were in the Dawn Era. While they were basically impenetrable thanks to the rivers and mountains, they launched sorties across into other lands where they raided, pillaged, and kidnapped all along the Athwart River, towards the Uyish Uina, into the Oogair Mountains, and against the tribes of antithesis who they hated the most. They fought basically perpetually in the name of Unima'u, and burned everything they could get their hands on to Unima'u. Most of the food, most of the people, most of the animals, most of the precious and uncommon food, and most of the metals were all burnt down, and surely the people of Aakow suffered for this deliberate destruction. It is within Aakow where the foundational myth for the start of the Dawn Era began. According to Aakow legend, a man named Oogair, who was born of the tribe of Juhijink, wished to climb Mount Chea'u and speak to Unima'u, breaking the silence with their god. Oogair was labeled as a fool and a heretic, and was exiled from Greater Aakow. Oogair, in exile, fled to Horjan, where he was welcomed and even encouraged by the locals to carry out his dreams. For years, Oogair trained and prepared for the hard journey up the tallest peak on Achotha until one day he finally began his journey. For months, Oogair climbed the mountains alone and poorly equipped, yet through some miracle he reached the peak of the world, though within an inch of his life. At the arrival of Oogair, Unima'u was shocked, yet impressed and sympathetic, and would do something never before witnessed. Unima'u healed the ailments of Oogair and kept him warm with a brilliant light, and then spoke to him in a song of light and flame for many days. By the end of the song, Oogair was gifted the knowledge of irrigation, writing, and metallurgy, and the much more divine powers of Ufieldma, which according to the cult of Unima'u could allow someone to control light and fire at their fingertips. Oogair, with his newfound knowledge and powers of Ufieldma, returned to Aakow, where he was crowned King Oogair I of the 5 tribes of Aakow, and the Dawn Era was declared, beginning the true intrigue and impact of Aakow civilization, and the official start of history and civilization on Achotha.